They gave him shelter for one night. By sunrise, 60 mounted figures stood in silence, waiting for him to answer for it. Ethan Cole didn't hear them arrive. Not the crunch of hooves on dry earth, not the leather creak of saddles settling under weight, not even the low breath of horses holding still in the pale morning air. What woke him was the absence of sound, the kind that presses against your ears like a warning you don't yet understand. And when he stepped out onto his narrow porch, boots scraping against old wood worn thin by years of dust and solitude, the world paused, like the land itself was, holding its breath. And then he saw them, lined along the ridge just beyond his fence line, silhouettes cut clean against the rising sun, men on horseback, unmoving, watching, not a rifle raised, not a word spoken, just waiting. And in that stillness Ethan felt something colder than fear settle into his chest, something older, something that whispered he had already crossed a line he couldn't see the night before. 12 hours earlier, the storm had come down hard over the plains, rain slanting sideways, wind dragging dust and grit through every crack in his cabin walls, the kind of storm that made a man grateful for a roof no matter how small. And Ethan had been alone, same as always, tending to a weak fire and a pot of beans that had long since lost their flavor, when the knock came, soft at first, then again, sharper this time, like someone running out of strength but refusing to fall, and he had. Frozen, hand hovering near the door, because out here, a knock after dark wasn't a request, it was a complication, and complications had a way of taking more than they gave. But the knock came a third time, followed by a voice, low, strained, not quite English, not quite anything he recognized at first. And when he opened the door, the wind pushed two figures into the frame of his world, two young women, soaked through, hair clinging to their faces, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion that bent their shoulders, one standing, barely, the other leaning against her, clutching at her side like she was trying to hold something in place that didn't want to stay. And for a moment, Ethan said nothing, just looked, because he knew what they were the second he saw them. The way they carried themselves, the way their silence felt heavier than words. Apache, and the old rules came back to him like a reflex. Don't get involved. Don't invite trouble. Don't cross lines drawn long before you ever set foot on this land. But then the younger one stumbled, just enough to break the stillness, and the older one caught her with a strength that didn't match her size. And in that small movement, something shifted, something simple, human, undeniable, and Ethan stepped aside without thinking, just enough for them to enter, the door closing behind them with a dull thud that sounded louder than it should have, like a decision echoing through wood and bone alike. And inside, the air changed, filled with the scent of rain, leather, and something faintly metallic that lingered near the younger girl's hands, where a thin silver bracelet caught the firelight, glinting once before disappearing beneath her sleeve, and Ethan noticed it without knowing why. The way a man notices a detail that doesn't belong, tucks it away, and only later understands its weight. But that night, he said nothing, just pointed toward the corner near the fire, kept his distance, and told himself it was just one night, just shelter from the storm, nothing more, nothing that would follow him into the morning, nothing that would stand now, silent and waiting, just beyond his fence line, as the sun climbed higher and the figures on horseback did not move, did not speak, did not leave, as if the land itself had gathered them there to remind Ethan Cole of something he had forgotten, or perhaps something he had never truly understood at all. By the time the sun had cleared the ridge, Ethan Cole had already counted them twice, not because he doubted the number, but because his mind needed something solid to hold on to, something measurable in a moment that felt anything but 60 riders, maybe a few more hidden beyond the slope, all positioned with a precision that spoke of discipline rather than threat, their horses standing shoulder to shoulder without a single restless step, as if even the animals understood that whatever was about to happen did not require noise. And that was what unsettled him most, not the numbers, not the weapons he could see glinting faintly in the morning light, but the silence, the kind that did not come from peace, but from certainty. And Ethan knew enough about this land to recognize that kind of certainty did not gather without reason. He rested one hand against the porch post, feeling the rough grain beneath his palm, grounding himself in something familiar, because everything beyond that thin strip of wood belonged to a world he had spent years avoiding, a world that did not forget debts, did not forgive misunderstandings, and did not measure right and wrong the way men in town liked to pretend they did. And for a brief moment, he considered stepping back inside, closing the door, pretending none of it was real, but that thought passed as quickly as it came, because men like Ethan did not get the luxury of pretending, not out here, not when the dust had already settled in a way that marked him as part of something larger than himself. Behind him, he could feel movement inside the cabin, subtle, careful, the kind of movement made by people who understood they were no longer unseen, and he did not turn to look, not yet, because whatever stood outside had come for him first, not for them, and that realization settled into him with a weight that was both heavy and strangely steady, like a truth he had always known but never needed to face until now. He remembered the way the older sister had watched him the night before, not with fear, not exactly, but with a kind of quiet calculation, as if she was measuring him against something he could not see, and how the younger one had barely spoken, her hand never leaving that silver bracelet, fingers curled around it even in sleep, as if it carried more than just memory. And now, standing on his porch with 60 riders waiting in silence, Ethan understood that nothing about last night had been simple, not the knock, not the storm, not the decision to open that door, and certainly not the two women now standing somewhere behind him, their presence turning a single act of shelter into something that stretched far beyond the walls of his cabin. A single rider shifted at the front of the line, not forward, not aggressive, just enough to break the stillness in a way that drew Ethan's attention like a thread being pulled tight, and from that slight movement, another figure emerged, older, steadier, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself because it was already understood, and even from this distance, Ethan could see the difference in the way the others held themselves, the subtle adjustment of posture, the quiet acknowledgement of someone whose authority did not rely on raised voices or sudden gestures. And in that moment, Ethan knew who he was looking at, not by name, not yet, but by the way the air itself seemed to settle around him, as if the land recognized him the same way the riders did. Ethan drew a slow breath, tasting dust and morning chill, and stepped down from the porch, one boot at a time, each step measured, deliberate, because rushing would mean fear, and fear had a way of turning situations like this into something worse than they already were, and as his boots met the ground, the sound carried just enough to remind him that he was still alone out here, one man standing between his own choices and whatever they had brought with them across that ridge, and he did not reach for a weapon, did not raise his hands, did not speak, because something in the way they waited told him that none of those things would matter, not yet, not until the right moment. And as the older figure began to guide his horse forward, slow and unhurried, closing the distance without urgency, Ethan felt that same quiet certainty return, the kind that does not shout, does not threaten, but simply exists. And he realized then that whatever was coming had already been decided long before. The storm, long before the knock, maybe even long before he had ever set foot on this land. And all that remained now was for him to understand his place in it. The man who rode at the front did not hurry, and that alone told Ethan more than any drawn weapon could have, because men who rush bring fear with them, but men who move slow bring certainty, and certainty was harder to stand against than anything else. And as the distance closed, the details began to sharpen, the braids threaded with bone and silver, the weathered lines across a face that had seen more seasons than most men in the valley would live through, the quiet weight in his posture that made the others behind him seem like echoes rather than equals. And when his horse stopped 10 yards from Ethan, it did so without command, as if even the animal understood where the line had been drawn. No one spoke at first, and in that space, Ethan became aware of every small thing. The way the wind brushed across the dry grass, but did not carry far, the faint creak of leather settling under still bodies, the distant call of a hawk circling somewhere beyond the ridge, all of it continuing as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because 60 men had come to his door without a single wasted motion, and that kind of presence did not arrive for nothing. The older man studied him, not quickly, not suspiciously, but with a patience that felt like being weighed rather than judged, and Ethan held that gaze without flinching, not out of defiance, but because looking away would mean giving up something he had not yet named, something tied to the choice he made the night before when he opened that door. A voice came then, steady, measured, carrying just enough English to bridge the space between them, and though the words were simple, they landed with the weight of something already decided. You gave them shelter. It was not a question, and Ethan understood that answering it would not change anything. But silence here would be its own kind of answer, so he nodded once, slow, deliberate. They needed a place out of the storm. The older man's eyes did not shift, but something in them settled, not approval, not anger, something quieter, something closer to acknowledgement, and for a brief moment, the tension in the air changed shape, not easing, but becoming clearer, like a line drawn in dust that both men could now see. Behind Ethan, the cabin door opened just enough to let a sliver of shadow fall across the ground, and he did not turn, but he knew they were there, the two sisters, watching, listening, their presence now no longer hidden but not yet part of the exchange, and he could feel the space between all of them tighten, as if every breath mattered. The younger one stepped out first, slow, careful, her hand still wrapped around that silver bracelet, and the light caught it again, just for a second, and this time Ethan saw what he had missed before, the markings etched into its surface, not decoration, but meaning, symbols that spoke of something carried, something claimed, and the moment stretched as the older man's gaze shifted from Ethan to the bracelet, and then to the girl, and in that shift, something unspoken passed between them, something that made the riders behind him sit just a fraction straighter, not moving, but aware in a way that had not been there before. The older sister followed, placing herself half a step ahead of the younger, not to block, but to stand with her, and when she spoke, her voice was low but clear, carrying a strength that had not been there the night before, he did not know. And for the first time since the riders arrived, there was something like urgency beneath the stillness, not panic, but the quiet push of someone trying to place a truth before it was too late for it to matter. Ethan frowned slightly, not at her, but at the space between all of them, because he could feel it now, the shape of something he had stepped into without understanding, something tied to that bracelet, to the way they stood, to the reason 60 men had come at dawn, without a single word of warning, and the older man lifted his hand just slightly, not to silence her, but to hold the moment in place, and when he spoke again, the words came slower, heavier, as if each one had already been weighed before being given. Knowing is not what makes it so. The sentence settled into the dust between them, simple, unyielding, and Ethan felt the meaning of it before he fully understood it, the way a man feels the shift in weather before the storm breaks. And for the first time since stepping off his porch, he realized this was not about what he had done, not really. It was about what that action meant in a world that did not measure things the way he did, and as the silence returned, deeper now, more defined, Ethan Cole understood that whatever came next would not be decided by intent, but by something far older, something carried in symbols, in silence, in the space between a man's choice and the meaning others give it. The wind shifted just enough to carry the scent of sage and damp earth between them, and in that quiet exchange of air, something unseen settled into place, something that did not belong to Ethan's world of fences and ownership, but to something older, something carried in memory and meaning rather than words, and he felt it in the way the older man's eyes lingered on the bracelet before returning to him, not accusing, not questioning, just steady, as if waiting for Ethan to understand what had already been set in motion. The younger girl tightened her grip on the silver band, her fingers pale against the metal, and for the first time since stepping out of the cabin, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her posture, not fear, but something close to it, like someone standing at the edge of a decision they did not choose but had to accept. And the older sister placed a hand lightly against her shoulder, a gesture small and controlled, yet full of weight, as if reminding her to stand still, to let what was coming unfold the way it was meant to. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it should have, and he glanced once toward the horizon, not to escape, but to measure the distance between what he knew and what he was standing in now, because out there, beyond the ridge, the land was simple, harsh, predictable in its own way, but here, in the space between 60 silent riders and two sisters who had stepped into his life with the storm, nothing followed the rules he had lived by. The older man spoke again, his voice unchanged, calm, deliberate. That bracelet is not hers to carry alone. And the words moved through the air without force, yet they landed with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not from the words themselves, but from the way they reshaped everything he thought he understood about the night before. He looked at the bracelet again, really looked this time, at the markings cut into its surface, the way the light caught along its edges, the way it seemed less like something worn and more like something entrusted, and he realized then that what he had taken for a simple piece of jewelry was something else entirely, something that carried meaning. Beyond its form, something that had followed those two sisters into his cabin and now stood at the center of everything unfolding before him. "I did not take anything," Ethan said, his voice steady but quieter now, not defensive, but grounded in the only truth he could offer, and the older sister nodded slightly, as if she had expected that answer, as if she had been waiting for him to say it out loud, and then she spoke, her voice low but firm. "You did not take it, but you accepted it when you let us cross your door," and the sentence lingered, heavier than the last, because it did not accuse, it explained, and in that explanation, Ethan felt the ground shift beneath the way he measured things, because in his world, shelter was a kindness, a choice made and forgotten by morning. But here, it was something else, something that bound action to consequence in a way he had never been taught to see. The older man inclined his head just slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of her words, and when he spoke again, the air seemed to still around him once more. What is given in darkness stands in daylight, and the meaning settled over the space between them like dust after a long ride, quiet, inescapable. And Ethan understood then that whatever had happened under his roof the night before had not ended when the storm passed. It had only begun, and now it stood before him in the shape of 60 riders and a silence that demanded something from him he did not yet know how to give. He shifted his weight, boots pressing into the dry ground, and for the first time since stepping off the porch, he felt the edge of uncertainty move through him, not fear, but the recognition that this was no longer about what he intended, but about what his actions meant in a world that did not bend to his understanding. And as the younger girl lowered her gaze slightly, her fingers loosening just enough on the bracelet for the light to catch it again, Ethan saw something else there, something he had not noticed before, not just meaning, but expectation, as if whatever that bracelet carried, it had already chosen its path, and he was now standing in it whether he wanted to or not. The silence did not break when the words settled. It deepened, stretching across the space between them until it felt like something you could step into and not come back from the same. And Ethan realized that whatever this moment was, it was not waiting for him to understand it. It was waiting for him to answer it, and the difference between those two things sat heavy in his chest like a truth he had no language for. The older man rested his hand lightly against the front of his saddle, not gripping, not preparing, just anchoring himself in place. And when he spoke again, the tone did not change, but the weight behind it did. "You opened your door, and the world inside changed." And the sentence moved slow, deliberate, like something carried across generations before it reached Ethan's ears, and for the first time, Ethan felt the edge of something he could not step around, not with silence, not with reason, not with the simple explanation that he had only meant to help. He glanced once more at the sisters, and this time he saw more than exhaustion and resilience. He saw the way they stood, not as guests, not as strangers, but as something already tied to what had been set in motion, and the younger one lifted her eyes just enough to meet his. And in that brief connection, Ethan understood that she knew, not everything, but enough to stand in this moment without surprise, and that unsettled him more than the 60 riders ever could. The older sister stepped forward then, just a single pace, placing herself not between Ethan and the riders, but between Ethan and what the moment was becoming, and her voice came quieter this time, not weaker, but more precise, like each word had been chosen carefully before being allowed to exist. "There are things that are given without asking," and she paused, not for effect, but because what followed mattered more than the breath it took to say it. "And once given, they do not return the same way." And Ethan felt the meaning of it settle before he could fully understand it. because something in him already knew that what he had offered the night before had not been taken lightly, not by them, not by the land, not by whatever rules shaped the world they belonged to. The older man watched the exchange without interruption, his presence steady as stone, and when the sister finished, he inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging that the moment had reached the point it was always meant to reach. And then he spoke, not louder, not sharper, but with a finality that left no space for anything else to enter. A door opened in the night, must be answered in the morning, and the words did not carry threat, but they carried something else, something that did not need to threaten because it already existed beyond choice. Ethan swallowed once, slow, feeling the dryness in his throat, and he let his gaze move across the line of riders again, not searching for escape, but recognizing what stood there, not an army, not a threat in the way he had been taught to see it, but a witness, a presence that had come not to take, but to see something completed, and that realization shifted something inside him, small, but undeniable. He looked back to the older man, holding that steady gaze again, and this time, when he spoke, his voice carried less certainty, not because he was afraid, but because he understood now that certainty was not his to hold in this moment. Then tell me what it is you are waiting for. And the question hung there, simple, direct, but heavier than anything he had said before, because now he was not speaking from his world. He was stepping into theirs, even if he did not yet know how far that step would take him. The older man did not answer right away, and in that pause, the wind shifted again, carrying a faint rustle through the grass, a reminder that the world beyond this moment still moved, still breathed, even as everything here seemed to stand still. And when he finally spoke, the words came with a clarity that felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else entirely. We are waiting for you to understand what you have already done. And the sentence settled into Ethan's bones, in a way no threat ever could, because it did not ask for action, it asked for recognition, and that, he realized, might be the harder thing to give. The words did not fade when they were spoken, they stayed, hanging in the air like something that refused to be ignored, and Ethan felt them settle into him slowly, not as a demand, but as a weight that shifted the ground beneath everything he thought he understood, and for a moment, he said nothing, not because he had no answer, but because the answer he had was no longer enough, and that realization came quieter than he expected, like a door closing somewhere behind him without sound. He looked down at his hands, rough from years of work, steady in ways that had always served him well, and he tried to measure this moment the same way he had measured every other problem in his life, simple, direct, something that could be handled with reason or distance. But this was neither. This was something that had already moved past reason the moment he chose to open that door in the storm, and now it stood in front of him asking not what he would do next, but whether he understood what had already been done. He lifted his gaze again, meeting the older man's eyes, and this time there was no attempt to explain, no effort to simplify, only a quiet acceptance that whatever came next would not follow the rules he had lived by. And the older man watched him with the same steady patience, as if he had seen this moment unfold many times before in different forms, with different men, and knew that understanding did not come all at once. It came in pieces, in pauses, in the space between what a man thinks he knows and what he finally sees. The younger sister shifted slightly beside him, the movement small but enough to draw his attention again to the bracelet, and for the first time, he noticed the way it did not sit loosely on her wrist, but rested there with purpose, like something that belonged exactly where it was meant to be, and he realized then that this was never something she had simply worn, it was something she carried, something that had weight beyond its metal, and that weight had now been shared the moment she crossed his threshold. The older sister spoke again, softer now, not to argue, not to explain, but to place something where it could no longer be ignored. When we came to your door, we did not come empty, and she let the words rest there before continuing. What we carried became part of your house the moment you said yes. And Ethan felt something shift deeper inside him, not fear, not regret, but a recognition that his world had been larger than he allowed himself to see, and that this moment was not changing it, it was revealing it. The older man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words, and then he spoke, his voice unchanged but carrying something final beneath it. A man does not choose only his action, he accepts what follows it. And the sentence settled into the quiet like a truth that did not need to be repeated, and Ethan understood then that this was not about punishment, not about blame, but about something else entirely, something that required him to stand inside the meaning of what he had done rather than step away from it. He drew a slow breath, feeling the air move through him with a weight it had not carried before, and for the first time since stepping out onto the porch, he did not look for distance, did not measure escape. He simply stood, present in the moment as it unfolded around him, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, but steadier than it had been since dawn. "Then I will stand in it." And the words did not rise, did not challenge. They settled, simple and clear, and something in the air shifted. Again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that the line of riders seemed to ease, just slightly, not in movement, but in presence, as if the moment had reached the place it had been moving toward all along. The older man watched him for a long breath, and then another, and in that silence, Ethan felt something pass between them, not agreement, not approval, but recognition, and when the older man finally spoke again, the words came slower, heavier, as if they had always been waiting for this exact moment to be said. "Then you will hear what the morning asks of you." And for the first time since the riders appeared, Ethan felt the shape of what was coming begin to form, not in detail, but in weight. And he knew, without needing to be told, that whatever it was, it would not be simple, and it would not be something he could turn away from, because the choice to open that door had already brought him here, and there was no path now that did not pass through what stood in front of him. The morning did not rush forward after those words, it settled deeper, as if the land itself was leaning in to listen, and Ethan felt the weight of it press against his chest, not heavy enough to break him, but steady enough that he could not ignore it. And he stood there, one man on open ground, facing something that had no edges he could measure, no shape he could predict, only a presence that asked him to remain where he was and not step away. The older man let the silence hold for a few breaths longer, not out of hesitation, but because the moment itself needed space to become what it was meant to be. And then he shifted slightly in his saddle, not forward, not back, just enough to mark that what came next would carry meaning beyond simple words. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, but there was something beneath it now, something that did not belong to him alone, but to the riders behind him, to the sisters, to the land itself. "You gave shelter, and you accepted what was carried." And the sentence echoed the truth Ethan had already begun to feel, but now it stood clear, undeniable, no longer something he could shape into his own understanding. Ethan did not interrupt, did not try to answer, because he knew now that speaking too soon would only show that he still did not see what stood in front of him. And instead, he listened, not just to the words, but to the space between them, to the way the riders remained still, to the way the sisters did not move, as if all of it had been arranged long before this morning ever came. The older man continued, each word placed with care. "What is carried by the daughter of a chief is never hers alone." And at that, the younger girl lowered her eyes slightly, her fingers tightening again around the bracelet, and Ethan felt the truth of it settle into him more fully, because now it was no longer just about an object. It was about what that object represented, something shared, something bound to people and place in a way he had never been taught to. "See." The older sister stepped closer to her, her voice barely above the wind, but clear enough to reach Ethan. "We did not choose the storm, but we chose your door." And there was no apology in her tone, no regret, only a quiet acceptance that choices, once made, did not belong to a single moment. They continued, they carried forward, and Ethan realized then that this was not something that could be undone by explanation, not something that could be balanced by intention. It was something that had already taken root. The older man looked at Ethan again, and this time, there was no distance left in the gaze, no space for misunderstanding, only a directness that asked for nothing but truth. And when he spoke, the words came with a final clarity that left no room to step aside. "You will take responsibility for what entered your house." And the sentence did not rise, did not threaten, it simply existed, and in that existence, Ethan felt the shape of the morning fully reveal itself. He let the words settle, did not rush to answer, because now he understood that the answer would not change what was being asked, It would only show whether he stood inside it or tried to step away. And as he looked from the older man to the sisters and back again, he felt something steady form within him, not certainty, but resolve, the kind that does not come from knowing what will happen, but from accepting that whatever it is, it will be faced without turning aside. He drew a slow breath, the air cool against his lungs, and when he spoke, his voice carried no defiance, no resistance, only the quiet weight of a man who had stopped trying to reshape the moment into something smaller. Tell me what that responsibility is. And the words moved into the silence and stayed there, not demanding, not pushing, simply present. And in that presence, something shifted once more, subtle, but real, as if the land itself had been waiting for that exact question to be asked. The older man held his gaze for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded, not as approval, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement that Ethan had reached the place he needed to reach. And when he spoke again, the words came softer than before, but heavier in meaning. You will not decide it, you will hear it. And with that, the morning crossed a line that could not be stepped back from, and Ethan knew, without needing anything further, that whatever came next would not be given to him as a choice, but as something already shaped, already waiting, something he could only meet, not change, and the stillness around them held, deeper now, more complete, as if even the wind understood that the moment had reached the edge of what could be said before it, became something else entirely. The silence did not loosen when the words were spoken. It drew tighter, as if everything that had led to this moment had finally reached the point where it could no longer stretch without breaking. And Ethan felt that tension settle into his bones, not sharp, not sudden, but steady, like a truth that had been approaching him from a distance and had now arrived without announcement. The older man did not move for a long breath, and then another, his gaze never leaving Ethan, as if measuring not the man himself, but the place he now stood in. And when he finally spoke, the words came slower than before, each one carrying a weight that did not need force to be understood. What you accepted binds you to what it protects. And the sentence did not rise, did not demand, it simply existed. And in that existence, Ethan felt the shape of the request begin to form, not fully, but enough that he could no longer pretend it would be simple. The younger sister's hand loosened slightly around the bracelet, and for the first time, she let it fall forward into the light, the silver catching the sun in a way that made the markings clearer than they had ever been. And Ethan saw it then, not as decoration, but as something deliberate, something carved with purpose, lines that spoke of identity, of belonging, of something carried not for oneself, but for many. And the realization settled into him with a quiet certainty. This was not an object, it was a responsibility, one that had never belonged to a single person. The older sister stepped closer to him, her presence calm, steady, and when she spoke, her voice carried something that had not been there before, not urgency, not fear, but something closer to trust. She carries what must not be lost. And the words did not need explanation, because the meaning of them filled the space between all of them, clear and unavoidable. Ethan did not look away from the bracelet this time, because now he understood that everything in this moment turned around it, not the metal itself, but what it represented, something that had been placed in his care the moment he chose to open his door, and he felt that understanding settled deeper than anything that had been said before. The older man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth of her words, and then he spoke again, his voice unchanged, but carrying the final shape of what the morning had been building toward. You will take her place until she returns. And the sentence landed without force, but it struck deeper than anything before it, because it was not a request, not a negotiation, it was something already decided, something that had been waiting for this moment to be spoken into the open. Ethan's breath caught, just slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what those words meant, because in them, he could see the path now, not fully, but enough, to carry what was not his, to stand in a place he did not belong, to hold something that tied him to a world he had spent years keeping at a distance. And for the first time since the riders had appeared, he felt the full measure of what it meant to accept what followed his actions. The younger sister lifted her eyes to him then, and there was no fear in them, no pleading, only a quiet understanding, as if she had known this moment would come, and had already accepted it long before the storm had ever reached his door, and that steadiness in her gaze did more than any words could have. It removed the last piece of distance Ethan had been holding on to. He let the silence hold for a moment longer, not because he needed time to think, but because the weight of the moment deserved it. And as the wind moved lightly through the grass, carrying the faint sound of the world beyond this moment, he realized that nothing about this would return to what it had been, not the land, not the cabin, not himself. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, not resisting, not yielding, simply meeting what stood before him. "Then I will carry it." And the words settled into the morning like something that had always been waiting to be said, and in that instant, the line between what had been and what would come next disappeared, leaving only the quiet certainty that some choices do not end when they are made, they begin there. The words did not echo when he said them. They settled, quiet and final, as if the land itself had been waiting for that answer and had no need to repeat it. And for a moment, nothing moved, not the riders, not the sisters, not even the wind that had carried the morning across the plains. And Ethan stood there with the weight of what he had accepted resting in his chest, not heavy in a way that crushed him, but steady in a way that would not leave. The older man watched him for a long breath, and then another, and in that stillness, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, not in the world around them, but in the space between them, and slowly, the older man inclined his head, not as a command, not as approval, but as recognition, the kind given when a man steps into something he did not seek, but does not turn away from. Behind him, the line of riders eased, not breaking formation, not moving forward, but releasing something unseen, like a held breath finally let go, and the air itself seemed to move again, carrying the faint sound of leather and distant wind back into the world. The younger sister stepped forward then, her movements careful, deliberate, and for the first time since the riders had appeared, she reached for the bracelet not as something to hold on to, but as something to give, and when she slipped it from her wrist, the light caught it once more, brighter this time, as if the morning itself had been waiting for that moment, and she held it out toward Ethan without a word. He looked at it for a second, just long enough to understand that this was not a gesture, not a symbol meant to be admired, but a passing, something real, something that now belonged to him not by desire, but by choice already made, and when he took it, his hand did not tremble, but it did not feel the same as it had before, because now he understood what rested in his palm was not metal, it was meaning. The older sister watched the exchange with quiet stillness, and when it was done, she spoke, her voice softer than it had been all morning, but clearer than ever. "It will not be yours forever." And Ethan nodded once, not because he needed the words, but because he understood them, because this was not ownership, it was stewardship, something carried for a time, something that would one day return to where it belonged. The older man turned his horse slightly then, not away, but enough to signal that what had come to be done had been done, and the riders behind him responded without command, their lines loosening just enough to begin the slow shift of departure, not rushed, not scattered, but steady, as if leaving was as deliberate as arriving had been, and in that movement, the morning finally broke, the stillness giving way to the quiet rhythm of hooves and wind and the wide, open land reclaiming its place. Ethan stood where he was, the bracelet resting in his hand, watching as the riders began to move across the ridge, their figures growing smaller against the light, and for the first time since the storm, the world felt familiar again, not because it had returned to what it was, but because he now stood differently within it. The sisters remained for a moment longer, the younger one meeting his gaze one last time, and there was something in her eyes now that had not been there before, not uncertainty, not expectation, but a quiet trust, as if she knew that what had been given would be carried the way it was meant to be, and then she turned, following the others without looking back. The older sister paused just long enough to stand beside him, not close, not distant, and she said one last thing, not as instruction, not as warning, but as something meant to remain. "What you carry will show you where you stand." And then she was gone, her steps light against the earth as she moved to join the others. Ethan did not follow, did not call out, he simply stood, alone once more in the wide stretch of land he had always known, but now, with something new resting against his palm, something that had turned a single night of shelter into a path he had not chosen, but had accepted all the same. And as the last of the riders disappeared beyond the ridge, the wind returned, soft and steady, moving through the grass and across the weathered wood of his cabin, and Ethan Cole remained where he was, the bracelet held loosely in his hand, understanding now that out here, some debts are not paid with words, and some choices do not end. When the door closes, they begin when it opens.